Hi everyone, welcome to the Tech Chat. My name is Tom and this is my definitive review of the LG G4. Now I thought the LG G3 from last year was a great phone. Not everyone agreed, it did have some issues, especially in regards to it was a bit slow and a bit laggy and a little bit unresponsive out of the box. It did improve if you were to root it, install a third-party launcher, and even the latest Android 5 Lollipop update made it a lot easier and nicer to use. But of course it still wasn't perfect. It was dogged a little bit by the 2GB of RAM and it just wasn't quite smooth and fast enough as you'd like for a 2014 flagship. Now fortunately on the G4 we have a faster processor, we have more RAM, we have the latest software from LG and also Android 5.1, so everything is smoother, nicer, more responsive and overall a lot more pleasurable to use. However, aside from better performance and an improved camera, there's not a whole lot that's new with the G4, and in some areas like the design I actually think it's maybe taken a bit of a step back from the G3, it's just not quite as good. But we'll go into that a little bit more detail, but it's going to be really interesting to see how the G4 stands up against the 2015 competition and whether it does enough to live up to the success of last year's G3. So let's take a look. Weighing 155 grams and at 9.8mm thick, the G4 is heavier and chunkier than the G3. It's 1.5mm wider too, which means despite featuring the same 5.5-inch screen, the screen-to-body ratio is now 72.5%. That's down 2.7% from the G3 last year. So it's wider, thicker, heavier, and has a lower screen-to-body ratio. I'm not sure the G4's design can really be considered an improvement. As well as being bigger, it's also less comfortable to use. The sharper, less rounded corners dig into your hand and it's actually one of the least comfortable phones I've used in quite a while. The polar opposite of the G3, if you recall my review of that, I praised its ergonomics as a borderline phablet compared with the Note 4 and the iPhone 6 Plus, for example. Unfortunately, the G4 just isn't as comfortable to hold. It's not uncomfortable exactly, just it's not as great. It's not as ergonomic as perhaps I might have expected following on from the G3. For one-handed use, a fair amount of hand and finger gymnastics will be required, so I think ideally it is a two-handed device. On the front of the plastic chassis, Gorilla Glass 3 protects the 5.5-inch display. It's a bit of a shame we're not seeing the Gorilla Glass 4, however, since that is featured on phones like the Galaxy S6. It's also worth noting the G4 doesn't have the oleophobic coating on the screen like the G3 did. It's a relatively minor point, but it means the G4 is a bit more susceptible to fingerprints and smudges. So first impressions aren't brilliant, but the G4 does have a few tricks up its sleeve that may just win me back round. First of all, it's the removable back cover, available in gold or metallic grey plastic like this one, with a brushed metal effect and subtle diamond pattern, or a rather more interesting and actually more expensive leather option. Regardless of whether you opt for the plastic or leather, the best part is that it's removable. Taking it off reveals a micro SIM card slot, a micro SD port that supports cards up to 2048GB in size, that's 2 terabytes in capacity, as well as a removable 3000 mAh battery. Fewer and fewer phones offer these features, so it's great to see here. Introduced on the G2, the rear buttons have become a regular feature on LG's flagship phones. So on the back of the G4 we have the volume and the power buttons. The volume is textured in contrast to the smooth power button, so you can work out which you're pressing from just from the feel. Although you do get used to it, I still find it's a little bit unwieldy to use. I often find myself smudging the camera lens because I've gone a bit too high. Above these buttons is the new 16 megapixel camera, flanked by a laser autofocus and an LED flash. Below is the speaker, unfortunately still relegated to the back corner, and on the base we have a micro USB 2 port, microphone, and 3.5mm jack. As a result of the volume and power being on the back, both sides are completely clear of any buttons. At the top we have an IR emitter and a noise cancelling microphone. Onto the front, software buttons mean there are no capacitive buttons taking up the bottom bezel, just an LG logo. At the top we have an 8 megapixel front camera, call speaker, and the usual light sensors and LED notifications light. The front bezels have a very small, very subtle diamond pattern effect. It's a smaller version of the diamonds found on the back cover, which I think gives it an almost carbon fiber look. One of the most interesting aspects to the design though is the subtle curve that LG have added to the G4. Dubbed the Slim Arc, it's not nearly as pronounced as the curve found on the LG G Flex phones, and it's barely noticeable looking at it straight on, but viewed from the side you can see there is definitely a slight curve. So presumably this curve may help reduce the reflectivity, the reflections you see on the screen because it is curved in a little bit. It also may help if you place it down on the desk because the screen goes in a little bit, maybe less of the screen is touching it. And perhaps if you're using it, to call someone, since the mic and the speaker is a little bit more optimally placed for your ear and mouth, it may also slightly improve call quality. But in reality, in my experience, it doesn't really make any difference. If you view side on, you can just notice it. It's kind of cool to look at, but I don't really see any real world benefit or fundamental difference for having that curve. It's a nice effect, it's a cool design, but that's pretty much it. The G4 features a big 5.5-inch Quad HD display. That translates to 538 pixels per inch, meaning it's incredibly crisp and sharp. Using what LG describe as a quantum display, the IPS LTD display looks really nice too. Whites look white without any hint of warm yellow or cool blue, which you can often find on other phones. Colours therefore are generally quite natural and vibrant. It's brighter than last year's G3 II, producing around 450 nits with brightness set to max. It's not quite as bright as the iPhone 6 or Galaxy S6, but still pretty good and usable in bright sunlight. Viewing angles are also pretty good. Colours retain their vibrancy even at quite acute angles, but you do notice quite a significant drop in brightness when viewed off-centre from around 30 degrees upwards. So although it's the same size and same resolution as the G3 display, it is a fair bit brighter and the colours are a fair bit punchier and more vivid, so it's a definite step up in terms of the display. Despite not offering the flagship Qualcomm Snapdragon 810 like the HTC One M9 or even the LG Flex 2 for example, the G4 uses the slightly less powerful 1.8 GHz 64-bit hexa-core Snapdragon 808. This is a decent upgrade from the 801 chip in the G3, but it's also not going to win any speed awards. That's fine though, it handles everything well and even intensive games run smoothly. The G4 scores just over 45,000 on the Antutu benchmark, a solid score but does trail the Galaxy S6's 61,000 and the HTC One M9's 52,000. So your initial thoughts may be, well, why haven't they included the Snapdragon 810? And although I don't know for sure, other than guessing it may be to do with the cost or manufacturing issues, there is an upside. I did find some minor throttling and overheating with the 810 found in the HTC One M9, and so it may not be an entirely bad thing for the G4 to use the 808 instead. Although the M9 did score higher on the benchmarks, the 808 is still the second fastest chip Qualcomm offer and is very, very capable. Alongside this is 3GB of RAM and 32GB of built-in storage, although only 22.6 GB are actually usable. The G4 also supports micro SD cards up to 2 TB, that's significantly more than the 128 GB on the G3. In terms of the user interface, although previously described as quite cluttered and maybe even a bit cartoony looking, the G4 introduces the LG UX4 software on top of the latest Android Lollipop 5.1. This makes the G4 much more responsive than the G3 was when it was released. It retains its fairly distinctive look, but it feels more grown up overall. The combination of the new software and faster hardware means the G4 is, for most of the time, very fast and responsive. Only occasionally has it slowed down for me when watching some videos or browsing some intensive websites on Chrome. Generally though, any slowdown can be fixed with a clear all of the apps, but coming from the Galaxy S6, the G4 is noticeably less responsive and apps are a bit slower to load. Still, it's an improvement over the G3 and for the vast majority of the time works brilliantly. For some reason it seems like fewer and fewer phones these days have a double tap to wake feature, but fortunately the G4 does and it works really well. You can even double tap on empty areas of the screen to put it back to sleep. Following its introduction in the G3, you can keep your phone safe using a knock code as well, instead of a normal password. Go to Settings, Lock Screen, and then select Screen Lock. From there, tap Knock Code, and then you can tap the square between 3 and 8 times in a pattern you will remember. This works well from my experience, although I would still recommend keeping the code relatively simple so it doesn't become too annoying or too much of a hassle trying to wake up your phone every time. Another interesting feature are the smart settings. Customize one of 3 categories: home, away, and accessory. For each, you can select specific sound profiles, turn on Bluetooth, and even automatically open the music app when headphones are plugged in. I can maybe see why you might want to try this, but it seems a bit too much hassle to set up. I'd rather just swipe down from the top and enable or disable Bluetooth that way, for example, rather than relying on these geo-specific settings. It's a nice idea, but I'm not entirely sure how useful it is every day. What is more useful though is the Smart Notice, which is the large widget you can find at the top of the main home screen, and it's actually one of the most useful default widgets I've ever seen. It provides the usual weather, time and temperature information, for example, but it also has a small message underneath that sometimes forecasts the weather, but also it's been quite useful as at one point the Smart Notice reminded me that the Spotify app, which I had been using a few hours earlier, was in fact still running in the background and actually using 2% of the battery every hour, even in its background idle state. I never knew this before, and in the future I will make sure to close Spotify fully when I'm finished using it. But it's small things like this that actually are really useful. I never knew that that was actually draining my battery. So Smart Notice is actually a really nice addition to the UI. Moving on from Smart Notice to Smart Bulletin, if you go to the left of the home screen, so swipe right, where on other phones you may find news feeds such as the Blink feed on the HTC One and Flipboard on the Galaxy S6, on the G4 you'll find the new Smart Bulletin. This is a slightly more useful kind of information feed that includes updates and info from the Health app, your upcoming events from the calendar, recently played music, and a range of smart tips for using the phone. You can edit the list of what comes up and even add more by downloading them from the LG Smart World. Multitasking comes in the form of the dual window feature. Tap the recent app buttons and then dual window to view a list of compatible apps. Tap two apps to open them in dual window mode. For example, you could open the web browser and messages at the same time. You can adjust the divider between them, giving one app more space over the other, and it's a pretty good use of the large 5.5-inch screen, although it is a fairly common feature on a lot of larger screen phones these days. Now the cameras on the front and the back of the G4 have been fairly significantly improved over the G3, which itself was a pretty good camera and actually introduced the laser autofocus system, so this builds on that success and actually is one of the best camera phones I've ever used. Gaining 3 megapixels, the G4 rear camera now boasts a 16 megapixel optical image stabilized camera with laser autofocus, LED flash, and is capable of recording video in 4K resolution. LG claim its f1.8 aperture lets in 80% more light than the f2.4 on the G3. In addition, the sensor is also 40% larger. This all helps the camera capture brighter and more detailed pictures and video. It also reduces noise in low light photos. I left HDR on for all these photos as I found it took a generally brighter and more vivid picture. Even though HDR does take 1 or 2 seconds to process, it does a decent job of improving the dynamic range of an image. However, it didn't always work perfectly, and sometimes certain subjects in an image, like this sign, were still too dark. But I'd still recommend leaving it on. Whether you prefer a simple point-and-shoot camera UI or access to more advanced options like the focus, shutter speed, white balance, and ISO settings, you can tailor the camera app to suit you. From the top left of the viewfinder, the 3 dots reveal simple, auto, and manual options. Each offering more options and settings than the last. It's pretty impressive how much you can change to take really specific and high quality shots. One of the most interesting aspects of the G4's camera is its ability to capture images in the RAW format. As well as the standard JPEG, you can select to take pictures in RAW, which is great for post-processing and editing, although it does produce a slightly larger file size. Video is just as impressive. With the OIS helping to keep videos smooth, you have the options to record in up to 4K resolution, as well as higher frame rates for slow motion videos. The front camera has also received a big upgrade over the G3, now boasting a whopping 8 megapixels, that's up from 2.1. This ensures pics and selfies are rich and detailed. It also has, like most phones do these days, one of those slightly ridiculous beautify sliders which makes your face, when you're taking a selfie, look like you've plastered foundation all over it. It's not for me, but it's sort of there if you want to use it, and presumably some people do, or else they wouldn't keep including it. Inside the G4 is a removable 3000 mAh battery, the same size as the G3, but battery life is actually a bit better than the G3, thanks to more efficient hardware and the latest software being a bit more optimized. I ran the Geekbench battery rundown test, which gives a good indication of battery performance. By itself, the results don't mean much, but when you compare it against the competition, it gives you a good idea of what kind of battery life you could expect. From a full charge, it took 5 hours and 14 minutes to fully run down, which is a pretty good score. By comparison, the iPhone 6 Plus only lasted 12 minutes longer. The Galaxy S6 was slightly better at 5 hours and 50, and the HTC One M9 was definitely below average at 3 hours 38. A good performance then from the G4, and the score is reflected in my experience of using it. After a full day of pretty typical use, messaging, web browsing, emails and YouTube videos, I'll still have around 30% of its charge left. So I'm confident to say it will last a solid day, maybe a day and a half with power saving mode enabled. Although the G4 lacks any sort of quick charging or wireless charging capability, it does have that removable battery, which I think is a genuinely useful feature. Aside from the standard battery saver function that you can select to come on at a certain battery percentage, which as you would expect dims the screen and reduces the processor speed a bit, the only other option within the settings for extending battery life is enabling Game Optimizer. Hidden away in the battery settings is an option to enable Game Optimizer, which changes the video quality of demanding games to help preserve as much battery as possible. But enabling it didn't really appear to do much though, in a good way. Games didn't look any worse and there wasn't any noticeable drop in frame rate. So unless you come across an incredibly intensive game and you are seeing some lag, perhaps turn it off, but otherwise I'd leave it on to extend the battery a bit more. Call quality is reasonable, if a little tinny, but it's serviceable. The G4 does support VO LTE or voice over LTE if you're in a country and on a network that supports it, but unfortunately I don't and I can't, so I can't test that for you. In terms of sound quality from the speaker is of course once again located on the back lower left corner. So unfortunately the speakers aren't great, the sound quality is just sort of passable, but I would recommend you use headphones with the 3.5mm jack on the bottom because the G4 does support high quality audio, so with a good pair of headphones or earphones you can actually get quite an impressive sound out of the G4. Just don't use a speaker if you can help it. So in conclusion, in some ways the G4 feels like a bit of a step back from the G3. It's kind of odd how a phone can be wider, fatter, thicker, heavier and even less comfortable to use than its predecessor. It seems a bit of a step back in terms of design. Of course, other than questionable design changes, the G4 is overall a better phone. Performance improvements through the software optimizations and just faster hardware mean it doesn't have any of those responsive issues, any of those lag issues that we did see with the G3 when it was launched. And so for that reason alone, it is obviously a better phone and much nicer to use. But it's worth noting that some people on the forums and then on the internet generally are noting that they have some sort of response issues with the touch on the screen. They're finding that the not code, that the double tap doesn't work for them and sometimes their fingers aren't registering taps on the phone. Now I haven't actually experienced this myself, but it seems to be fairly widespread, so it may be worth, if you do buy one of these, to check that everything works quite well and give it a good go, see if everything works, and if it doesn't then perhaps you'll discover it quickly enough that you can return it, exchange it or some other way. But it's worth noting that and just be aware that maybe for you as some others have been suffering from some slight technical issues with the phone. Now for me, one of the best features of the G4 are the cameras. Both front and rear have been substantially upgraded over the G3 and actually produce some really cracking results. Pictures are detailed and sharp and the HDR really adds some great dynamic range to the images. It's not perfect, it's a little slower than the Galaxy S6 for example, and there aren't all as many functions as some would like, but the Pro mode does add a lot of options, a lot of settings that you can choose, from shutter speed and ISO and focus to white balance and many more. So whether you prefer just like an auto point and shoot or a fully manual Pro mode, it does give you that capability. And the front 8 megapixel, rear 16 megapixel, and very fast laser autofocus means it is extremely capable. And as I say, one of the best cameras on a phone I've used for a long time, and really is up there with the iPhones and Galaxy S6s of the world. Now in terms of price, the G4 does cost over twice what you can find the G3 for at the moment. It's most good retailers you can find this for just under £500, which is pretty reasonable for a flagship device. Now most flagships, most new phones do often cost, there's a premium over the last generation of course, and no phone is twice as good as the last generation. But to think that you could get the G3, which is very good and very similar to this, there isn't a huge amount of improvement on the G4 over the G3 for sort of £230, £240, as opposed to this, which is sort of £480, £500. It really is worth considering actually the G3, surprisingly, although if you do prefer having the latest and greatest tech and all the new shiny bits and pieces, then obviously the G4 will be the one for you. But it's worth noting that it's still, its predecessor is still pretty good value, and although this is now comparable to the Galaxy S6 and One M9 for example in terms of price, that the competition is pretty strong. And speaking of competition, I think that's one of the biggest challenges that the G4 faces. Being 5.5 inches, it sort of goes against the normal size phones as well as the phablets. You've got the Sony Z3s, the Galaxy S6s, HTC One now, M9s, OnePlus Ones, iPhone 6 Pluses, and Note 4, for example. It sort of goes against all of those. You could compare it against all those sorts of phones. And it sort of just doesn't have that kind of wow factor for a 2015 phone that we're sort of used to. I think the G3 in 2014 had a lot more going for it than this one. So overall, the LG G4 is a pretty good phone. It's got a really good display, it's bright and sharp, it's got reasonable performance thanks to the upgraded processor and newer software. And in terms of the software, it does come with quite a few pretty cool features, and the UI is a lot nicer and more responsive to use than the G3. So the camera is also exceptional, battery's pretty solid, and overall it's a pretty good phone. For me though, it's just a little bit uncomfortable to use. It may be different for you may have bigger or smaller hands, which improves it, but it just, the corners stabbing a little bit, it's a little bit fat, the back isn't the most attractive to look at, although you may prefer the leather option, which I think perhaps I may have preferred in hindsight. But it's definitely capable. Micro SD and removable battery are definite selling points, and that camera, both cameras in fact, are very, very good. So good phone, solid. If I had to give it a score, which I don't like doing particularly, it'd be sort of a 7.5 to an 8. But you can't go wrong with it. All I would say though is that, strangely enough, the G3, the predecessor, is still worthy of consideration. So this has been my definitive review of the LG G4. I hope you've enjoyed it. I've certainly enjoyed reviewing it. If you have any questions or thoughts, please leave them in the comments below. And hopefully, if you can subscribe, you'll keep up to date with my latest videos. And I'll be uploading a Galaxy S6 versus LG G4 camera comparison very soon. So that's all there is. That's all there is to say. Thank you very much for watching. Please subscribe and check out thetechchap.com for more. And of course, follow me on Twitter at thetechchap. And hope you have a great day. And hopefully, we'll see you again soon. Thanks a lot. Cheers.